In this video we will go through how the Lumariver depth of field calculator works. The app is available for Android and iOS. The user interface is adapted for mobile phones, but you can also use it on tablets. It's designed as a practical tool for landscape or architecture photography or other genre where you typically want the whole photograph to appear as sharp as possible. It's highly configurable, and a key feature is that you set it up with your own cameras and lenses, so you easily can make the calculations on the gear you actually have at hand. Let's start looking at the app. This is the main depth of field screen. It's built around 4 interconnected scrollers: f-stop, that is lens aperture, depth of field near limit, depth of field far limit, and focus distance. When you activate one scroller, the others will follow according to the depth of field formulas. You can lock one scroller and then the others will adjust to work in the new limited range. For example, let's lock the near limit to 2 meters. If we now increase the far limit, f-stop and focus distance must also increase. If we reduce the far limit, f-stop and focus distance must decrease. The closest entry has the smallest possible f-stop for the selected lens and thus the shortest depth of field, and the closest we can get to the locked 2 meter near limit. You can do the same with the other scrollers, but only one can be locked at a time. The f-stop scroller has fixed entries according to what's available on the chosen lens. In the settings you enter your own cameras and lenses, and there you can specify things like available f-stop range, f-stop divisions, 1/3, 1/2 or full stops, which is used in the f-stop scroller. This lens is a 47mm medium format digital lens with a range from f5.6 to f32 in 1/3 steps. No matter how you turn the scrollers, it will never point out an f-stop that can't be selected on the lens. The focus distance scale also have fixed entries and can be configured in various ways. You can, for example, make it match a classic rangefinder scale if you would use that in the field. As depth of field formulas depend on many parameters and rarely add up exactly to a fixed scale, the scroller scales are auto-adjusted as needed. This means that the active line of numbers in the center are always showing the correct values without being rounded to any fixed scale. You will also see that when you lock a scroller, the scales are adjusted to fit the new limited range. Above the scrollers there is a depth of field diagram which is updated as you change the scrollers. It's true to scale and uses a 1.8 meter man figure and a 10 meter tree at 10 meter distance to visualize the current scale. The diagram scale is automatically adjusted to fit relevant information. The green field is the depth of field with distances to near limit, plane of focus and far limit marked on their respective lines. The blue line represents the sensor or film plane. The dashed red and green lines represent the hyperfocal distance and the corresponding near limit. Those give a visual indication on how close you are to have a depth of field that reaches all the way to infinity. By tapping the diagram you toggle between absolute or relative distances on the near and far limits. The relative distances is relative to the plane of focus, that is, near limit is 1.85 meters in front of the focus distance and the far limit is 4.94 meters behind. The total length of the depth of field is displayed below the diagram. Current is 6.79 meters. The relative distances and total depth of field is there for informational purpose. In the field you will in practice almost always use the absolute distances, as it's that you will measure or estimate. As you can see, the diagram is animated with the scrollers. If you find that distracting, you can turn off animation in the settings and then it will just update in a snap. The two green buttons at the bottom provides a unique feature, which is to switch between a sharper and a softer depth of field limit on the near and far edge separately. The idea is that in a situation when it's hard to fit the scene within the sharper depth of field, you can choose to soften either the foreground or background or both just slightly and gain more depth of field. For example, if the scene calls for hyperfocal focusing and you have a detailed city landscape in the background, you may not want to compromise sharpness at infinity, but you may accept to render the foreground just slightly softer. As you can see here, we gain about 2 extra meters in the foreground. Exactly how sharp the sharp and soft modes are is configurable in the settings screen. That is, you can set the circle of confusion sizes, not only to a fixed value, but also to be auto-adjusted relative to pixel pitch or air disk diameter or both. How to choose the optimal circle of confusion size for your shooting style is discussed in detail in the manual. If you think it's overkill to have these options to switch circle of confusion sizes, you can disable it in the settings and then the buttons are removed from the user interface. The header of the screen shows the name of the currently chosen camera system, lens and lens focal length. The cog button brings you to the settings screen. By tapping the names, you get to choose among the available camera systems and lenses you have configured into the app. If the lens is not a zoom lens, tapping the focal length will bring you to the lens selection rather than the focal length selector. The footer always shows the hyperfocal distance for the current lens and f-stop. The idea is that in a stressed situation, you always have the hyperfocal distance and the resulting depth of field readily available. Focus stacking is an optional feature that you can turn on or off in the settings screen. Stacking is most usable with cameras that have a high precision focusing ring or other means to move the lens in precise steps. You can read more about stacking techniques in the manual. When enabled, the stack button is visible in the top left. The number under the button is the depth of focus, that is, depth of field in the sensor plane. Here it is 0.34 millimeters. The way depth of focus works is that it only changes with f-stop and circle of confusion size. When pressing the stack button, we get to choose in which range we want to stack, that is, what we want the final depth of field to be. The screen is now in stacking mode. In addition to the depth of focus number, we now have got one extra smaller number which shows how much the lens should be moved between each frame in the stack. The number is smaller because there is a 20% overlap per default, but it can be adjusted in the settings screen if you prefer some other value. For normal cameras, this is only informational, but if you have a view camera with a millimeter scale on the focusing rail, you can step this number between each shot. To make that easier, it's also possible to configure a round down to the closest quarter, third, half or full millimeter. When the stacking mode is active, the focus distance scale has been limited to the chosen stack range. We have got dashed blue lines in the diagram that shows the edges of the stack range, and we have got 2 extra buttons in the bottom corners used for moving the stack forward and backward. As you can see, the buttons are updated with the number of frames required to reach to the end of the stack from the current position. In the basic case, you will choose a shooting aperture, start at one end and just step through to the other end. You can, however, choose to change aperture while stacking. For example, you may need sharpness at the far end the most. You will then start at the far end with the ideal aperture, shoot one frame or two, then increase aperture for the remaining shots to reduce the number of frames required. The stack will stop when the plane of focus is at the stack edge, but you can of course choose to stop when the depth of field reaches it if it's suitable in that particular shooting situation. To exit the focus stacking mode, you tap the stack button again, which has changed name to no stack. We have now looked at the functions available in the main depth of field screen. Now let's go through a few typical real use cases and how you then use the app to solve the depth of field problems optimally. Case 1. If we have f-stop x and focus distance y, what is the near and far depth of field edges? This is the standard question in most regular depth of field calculators, so we cover it here, but frankly it's not the type of question you ask when out shooting for real. Anyway, this is how you do it. First set the f-stop, set the focus distance. The near and far limit scrollers moves accordingly, and there you have the answer. You get the absolute distances from the film plane, the total span of the depth of field, and if you toggle the relative mode by tapping the diagram, you see how much the depth of field stretches in front and back from the plane of focus. If you have the soft and sharp buttons enabled like here, you can tap those and see how it grows and shrinks depending on circle of confusion size. Case 2. If we have focused at main subject C and want depth of field from A to B, what aperture do we need? This is the typical real question to ask if you have a camera with live view or a view camera with ground glass. With these cameras you generally don't have a precise distance scale on the lens, so you always need to focus at something. Then you use a separate rangefinder or simply estimate the distance to the subject you have focused at, plus the distances to the desired near and far limits. Personally, I use a classic lights focus rangefinder, but there are many other options. You really don't need to worry about getting exact measurements. The nature of depth of field is that it's quite forgiving regarding distances. Actually, I don't always use the rangefinder, but instead just visually estimate in many conditions. Let's get on to how we use the app in this scenario. First, set the focus distance to our subject distance. Let's say it's 5 meters. In this case, we had an entry in the distance scale that was an exact match. It's possible to configure the distance scale such that it matches the scale on the rangefinder, including half steps, and that is a good idea if you are using one. Say that we hadn't done so and we wanted to focus on 5.2 meters. We only have 5.0 and 5.4 to choose from. The scale is however optimized so that the difference between entries are no larger than about 30 micrometers in lens adjustment. If you want even finer spacing, it can be configured, but the point is that in actual lens focus setting, those two numbers are really very close. So if our focus distance had been 5.2 meters, I would choose 5 or 5.4 on the scale. Next, we lock the focus scroller so it doesn't move when we adjust near and far limits. We then see how the near and far limit scales are adapted, as with the focus distance locked, the only parameter that can affect depth of field is f-stop. Let's say we have measured or estimated the depth of field range from 3 to 10 meters. The distance scales are now even coarser as they are limited by f-stop settings, but that is how it should work. Let's set the far limit to the first entry above 10 meters, which is 12.9 meters. Then we look at the near limit if it covers 3 meters. It's at 3.10, which we may decide is close enough, or we move one more step to 2.82 meters. F-stop then increases to F16, and as a side effect the far limit is up at 22 meters. So now we have answered the question. We need to shoot at f16 to cover the desired range in this case. Case 3. We want depth of field to go from A to B. What is then the required aperture and focus distance? This use case is typical if you have a high precision focusing ring like on some medium format technical cameras. Many professional architecture photographers work with this type of gear, and the advantage is that you can easily and precisely dial in a very specific focus distance, so you don't need an object to focus at. With this type of camera, it's quite likely that you would use a laser distance meter to measure distances and thus get very precise range finding. It's indeed overkill in terms of precision, but easy to use. In some scene there is something to focus at in all distances, and then this workflow also applies to live view cameras, as you can use a rangefinder to find out where to focus. Say we want to cover 3 to 10 meters. Then we first dial in the far or near limit and lock it. And then we adjust the other limit to cover our desired range. We now see that we should focus at 4.5 meters and set the f-stop to f14. The walkthrough of the depth of field screen is now complete, and next up is the tilt screen. The tilt button is only available if the currently selected lens supports tilt. Let's press it to switch to the tilt screen. This screen is a bit more complex than the main depth of field screen, and we assume that you're somewhat familiar with the basic of the Scheimpflug principle. As you see in the diagram, the depth of field is a wedge, which is the basic property of the depth of field of a tilted lens. This app focuses on the traditional landscape use case with a near-far composition, where the aim is to gain more depth of field close to the camera than you will with hyperfocal focusing. The hyperfocal footer and the lens focal length, which if pressed allows you to switch to another focal length, are the same as in the main depth of field screen. Due to space limitations, the header is not there, so if you want to switch camera system or get to the settings, you need to go back to the main depth of field screen by pressing the No Tilt button. The tilt screen borrows the same concept regarding interconnected scrollers and lock buttons as found in the main depth of field screen. There are 4 scrollers: f-stop, tilt hinge combined in one scale, wedge span on the sensor at infinity, and plane of focus incline as distance from the sensor center using the same unit as the wedge span. The span unit is configurable and is either millimeters on the sensor, which is here, or millimeters on live view, or percentage of the width or height of the sensor. The idea is that you can measure these distances directly on live view or ground glass with a smaller ruler, or just estimate. As you can see, the scrollers are interconnected to stay at coherent positions. The lock button that affects plane of focus incline, that is, the focus distance, is always locked with a text beside it. It's either far, near, or plane of focus, and when you press the button you cycle through the different settings. Let's change the f-stop for the different lock settings to see the difference. With the lock at far limit, the incline is adjusted so the far limit stays at the same value, 0 degrees in this case. The behavior is the same for the other settings. Typically you will have the far limit locked as you want that to follow the ground. The other lock buttons work the same as on the main depth of field screen. Only one can be locked at a time, and they lock the scroller above the button, limiting the range of the others correspondingly. The tilt screen diagram consists of 2 parts. a view from the side showing the wedge shape of the depth of field, and a flat sensor plane view showing the projection at infinity. Let's start with the wedge. It shows the near limit, plane of focus and far limits in degrees, either in absolute numbers, where 0 is horizontal, relative to the plane of focus, where the plane of focus is still absolute, or numbers relative to the ground, which matters if we tilt the camera, which we will show later. You tap on the diagram to cycle through the modes, and you see the active mode in the top left corner. The dashed brown line is a ground line, which per default is the same level as the hinge line. It can be adjusted, as we will show later. The gray dashed line is the lens center perpendicular from the sensor plane. As the sensor plane is so close to the lens, it's omitted from the diagram. You can approximate the hinge distance blue line to be the same. The dashed vertical green line is the hyperfocal near edge for the current f-stop. The diagram is always scaled so it fits, as the most interesting space is the gain in front of the hyperfocal near limit. If you don't need anything there to be in focus, it's typically a better option to shoot without tilt instead. The diagram is animated as you turn the scrollers. If you find that distracting, you can turn it off in the settings, and then the diagram is updated in a snap. As you can see, if the wedge goes off limits for the number labels, they stay at their maximum positions, and the colored dots help you to see which is which, as well as their vertical order, of course. The second part of the diagram shows a sensor plane view and where the depth of field hits at infinity, that is, the wedge span. In absolute mode, the numbers are relative to the lens center, that is, sensor center before any shift is applied. In relative mode, near and far limits are relative to the plane of focus, and in ground mode, all numbers are relative to the projected ground line, which is the same as the lens center if the camera hasn't been tilted. Roundings are always conservative, so the numbers don't indicate more depth of field than you have, but rather a little bit less. Here the far limit 6 mm has been rounded up, and the near limit 24 mm has been rounded down, yielding a total span of 18 mm, but as we can see in the span controller, the actual range is 19.6 mm. This is a result of the conservative rounding, and it's there so you can safely measure the limits on the ground glass or live view and not get an overestimation. While most are familiar with the wedge, hinge distance and near and far limit angles, fewer have seen this concept with wedge span at infinity. When we go through the focusing workflow later, it will become clear how it's used in practice. If the sharp soft circular confusion buttons have been enabled, there's also one in the tilt screen. Due to space limitations, it's only one button, but you can cycle through all combinations by tapping it repeatedly. Note how the far limit stays the same as the incline lock is set to the far limit. A typical sharpness trade-off with a tilted depth of field is to sacrifice some sharpness of treetops, as it sits higher in the resulting image, and you would then use a softer near limit. The focus button at the bottom right shows the resulting focus distance, and when you press it, the incline is set such that the far limit becomes parallel with the ground, which is something many scenes call for. The ground button allows setting a vertical distance from the camera down to the ground. In the typical use case, you set the hinge distance to the same as the ground, so you don't really need to care about any specific ground distance. And this is default, as you see here on the button, ground equals hinge. However, if you are tilting a longer focal length, it can be useful to have a hinge distance that is significantly longer than the ground distance. The reason is that a longer lens requires more tilt, which results in a narrow wedge span. But as the field of view is narrow, the closest visible ground is far away, and you can then reduce tilt and let the wedge start below the ground and grow up as it approaches the closest visible ground. Let's show with an example. Here we have a 90mm lens, hinge and ground distance at 1.7 meters, and as we can see, the depth of field wedge here is quite narrow. When we press the ground button, we can set a specific ground distance. Let's set it to 1.7 meters, which is my typical tripod height. Now we can see in the button that the ground distance is 1.7 meters, and we can see in the diagram that the ground has moved and we have got intersection indicators. Let's increase the hinge distance, that is, reduce the tilt to make it clearer. Presenting those intersections is the purpose of the ground distance feature. We now see that the near limit of the wedge comes up through the ground 8.2 meters away, and in the sensor plane that's 18 millimeters below the center, which would be at the edge of a medium format 48 x 36 mm sensor, which happens to be the sensor used here. In this example, we could thus reduce the tilt from 3 to 2 degrees and gain significant wedge span. For wide-angle shots, the gain is typically so small that you can stay with the traditional method and set the hinge distance to the ground distance. To return to that mode, you press the ground button again and set ground to hinge. If you are using a lens capable of both tilt and shift, the typical use case is to keep the camera level and adjust the vertical composition by shifting. This way, tree trunks and other vertical features are rendered upright, which is one of the key features of a tilt-shift lens. Shooting with the camera level is the normal operation and what you probably will do in most cases. However, in some cases you may still want to tilt the camera, and then you press the camera tilt button. You can set the tilt either manually with the scroller or use the device sensor. In this demonstration video I'm using a simulator which doesn't have a sensor, so the value is stuck at 0. If I would be using a phone, I could put it on a level surface on the camera to measure its tilt and press the OK sensor button. Now we set tilt using the scroller instead. Negative values means a forward tilt that is looking down towards the ground. We can see that the diagram stays horizontal, but the ground line points up, meaning that the camera looks down, and we have got a vertical lens to ground line too. When the ground distance is bound to the hinge distance, it's automatically compensated for the camera tilt and will in this case be a bit smaller. The actual value is shown in the ground button. Here the hinge distance is 2.69 meters and the resulting ground distance is 2.60 meters. If we cycle through the degree display modes in the diagram to the ground mode, we see that the far limit is now at -15 degrees. If we press the focus button, the far limit is set parallel to the ground again. Let's activate the ground intersections by setting a fixed ground distance again. The horizontal intersection distances, 1.9 and 4.1 meters here, is always calculated from the point vertically below the camera, where the vertical dashed brown line connects to the ground line. In the sensor plane part of the diagram, the projected ground level at infinity is now shown as a brown dashed line, and with the unit display mode set at ground, the distances are relative to that. The headings above the tilt, span and incline scrollers are buttons, and if you press them you can set the corresponding values by measuring angles using the device's tilt sensor. Let's start with plane of focus incline. The button opens a modal which contains instruction of how to measure. You should carefully aim the device in the direction you want, looking with one eye along the screen while holding the device with the screen facing up. While holding still and thus not looking at the screen, you tap anywhere at the modal and the device will buzz to indicate that the measurement was recorded. Ideally, the measurement should be made from the hinge line, which is not really practical, so you need to take hinge line parallax into account. This is fortunately easy. If the distance from where you hold the device down to the hinge line is 2 meters, you just aim 2 meters above the target. If you aim at a distant target, the hinge parallax will of course be negligible and you can ignore it. In this video we are using a simulator which doesn't simulate the tilt sensor, so we only see 0 degrees here. When we tap the modal we get back with the incline set, in this case 0 degrees. Note that it's not possible to aim down, it will then be truncated to 0. The reason is that in order to point the plane of focus down you need to focus the lens past infinity, which is not possible on most tilt-shift lenses. It is possible on view cameras though, but as the use case is very rare, we have skipped that in this app to keep it simpler. Let's go on to the next button, the span. The same type of modal appears and we do the measurement in the same way. In this case it's a two-phase process. First we measure the near limit or far limit and then we measure the other. Aim, tap the screen, aim, tap the screen, and we get back to the tilt screen with the span set to match our measured angles. Here we generally don't need to consider hinge parallax as we measure the depth of field edges. As a side effect, also the incline is set, meaning that you typically don't need to use the incline button. The final measurement button is for the hinge distance or ground distance. The objective here is to measure a vertical distance by first aiming at the base, usually an object at the ground some distance away, and then set the horizontal distance to it. So first aim at the base from camera height or compensate for the parallax and tap the screen. In this simulator the angle gets hard-coded to 10 degrees just for demonstration. Then we get this distance scroller to manually set the horizontal distance, which you could measure with a rangefinder. Finally you choose if the resulting vertical measurement should be applied to the hinge distance or to the ground distance. We set the hinge distance here. We have now looked at all functions in the tilt screen, so now let's go through some typical real use cases. When you have a camera with live view or a view camera with ground glass, you generally don't use the app for setting plane of focus incline. You simply just zoom in on live view and focus at the middle of the tallest object in the scene. You still need to know which f-stop and lens tilt to set though. Tilt decides the hinge distance, and in the typical wide-angle shot you set it to the same as the ground distance. F-stop decides the wedge span, so you set that to cover the tallest object in the scene from base to top. Let's go through a basic example. Here we are using a 47mm lens on a 48x36mm digital medium format sensor. It corresponds to a 35mm lens on a full-frame 135 camera, that is a fairly wide field of view. Let's say the distance from the camera to the ground is 1.7 meters. Then we just set the hinge distance to the closest larger value, as it's often better to set the hinge distance a bit lower than the ground than higher. But it depends on how the ground looks. With a more 3D content, setting it a bit higher is often better. We set it to 1.80 meters here. Now we see that we should set the tilt to 1.5 degrees. Next is to figure out which wedge span we need. We can simply measure the tallest feature on live view or ground glass and set the span to match. Just make sure that it really is the tallest feature, even if we look from the hinge line, which is where the depth of field wedge actually starts. We can use the span angle measurement too if we like by pressing the span button. We can allow empty sky or soft clouds to be autofocused as it won't be noticed anyway. Say the tallest feature is a mountain in the background which takes up half the sensor height, that is 18 millimeters. Then we set the span to the closest above, which is 20.7 millimeters, and we get f14 as the resulting f-stop. You can have a small ruler to measure on live view. If you prefer to estimate with your eyes rather than measure, which is perfectly feasible, you may prefer to have the span configured as percentage of sensor width or height, which is also possible. Now when we know the tilt is 1.5 degrees and f-stop f14, we have all we need. We just focus at the middle of the tallest feature and shoot. If you have a technical camera with a high precision focusing ring where you can precisely dial in the focus distance, we can use the app to calculate that too. Then you need to set the incline. By using the span measurement button and measure near and far limit angles, you set the span incline at the same time, which may be your preferred way to work. If you know the ground is horizontal, you can just set the far limit to 0 degrees by pushing the focus button. The ground distance and intersection feature becomes useful when you shoot longer lenses, say 50 mm or longer 135 equivalent. The idea is then to set as large hinge distance as possible in order to gain wedge span without having to stop down excessively. We've already looked at this when the ground button function was demonstrated, so we don't repeat it here. What if the ground is sloping? The app doesn't support setting a slope for the ground, but instead you just think of the ground as the reference and set the camera tilt in relation to that. Keep an eye on the hyperfocal distance so you don't engage in a complex tilt compromise when plane focusing would suit the scene better. As a rule of thumb, tilt is useful when the visible ground in the image is close due to a low tripod, a lens shifted down, or a camera looking down. If you don't have close ground visible due to a lens shifted up, for example, plane focusing usually works just as well or better. Likewise, if you have tall objects close, such as in a tight forest scene with tree trunks from top to bottom in the image frame, it's rarely possible to solve the problem with tilt. Also consider that as the wedge is razor thin close to the camera, there will nearly always be some compromise unless the ground is very flat. That is, use the app as a support in your own judgments. Don't expect it to provide the perfect no compromise solution, as it's rarely possible in practice. In close scenes, such as when you point the camera down and focus on a small patch on the ground, it's usually better to use traditional tilt focusing technique than using the app. That is, choose a near and far point and use tilt and focusing wheels to focus peak on live view or ground glass. The app is most useful in grand open scenes where tilt focus peaking is often difficult, making it easier to measure or estimate the distance to the ground and adapt the hinge distance accordingly. That's all for now. If you want further details and information about the various ways to configure the app, take a look in the manual. We made this app because we needed it ourselves in our own photography, and we hope that you will enjoy it and find it as useful as we do. Thanks for listening.